When the President of the United States declared that America doesn't need Canada, it wasn't just a shocking statement. It was a moment when a superpower publicly denied the extent of its own dependence on its closest ally. The issue isn't about emotion, nor is it about political opinion. The issue lies in the numbers: cold, clear, and indisputable. In just the next few minutes, we'll take a closer look at those numbers to answer one simple question. Does the United States truly not need Canada, or is this a dangerous illusion of power? If you're someone who values slow, deep analysis over clickbait headlines, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now, because the rest of this video won't be about slogans, it'll be about reality. Some statements in geopolitics aren't meant to explain. They're meant to test the world's reflexes. They're like a pebble tossed into a still lake. The pebble itself may be small, tiny, but the ripples travel far. The claim that the US doesn't need Canada is one of those statements. At first glance, it sounds like a bold assertion, even a challenge. But if you listen more closely, behind that confidence lies a troubling void, the gap between the feeling of power and the actual structure of the modern world. For more than a century and a half, the US-Canada relationship has been treated as a given, the world's longest undefended border, an economic space where goods, energy, people, and trust flow almost without question. Because it's so familiar, this relationship rarely becomes the center of debate. It's like the air we breathe. Only when it's threatened do we realize how vital it is. When that statement came out of the White House, the key issue wasn't the hard tone, it was the story it tried to tell. A story of absolute self-reliance, of an America that can stand entirely on its own without needing anyone. In the context of domestic politics, that story is compelling. It taps into frustration with globalization, with obligations perceived as unfair, with a sense that America has given more than it's gotten back. But geopolitics doesn't run on feelings, it runs on structure. And structure doesn't care about slogans. Whenever a major power claims it doesn't need a critical partner, the real question isn't whether they have the right to say so. It's what the cost of believing that statement might be. Because in the modern world, not needing rarely means not depending. More often, it just means that dependence has become invisible, buried in systems so seamless that people forget they even exist. With Canada, that invisibility is especially dangerous. There are no military convoys, no tense televised negotiations, no ultimatums, just silent flows, goods crossing the border daily, electricity feeding the grid, fuel powering factories and cities. They're so quiet, so constant that they're easy to take for granted until someone asks whether they're still necessary. And it's in that moment, when a relationship is reduced to a political soundbite, that reality begins to strike back. Not with words, but with numbers. Not with emotions, but with the cold precision of math. Because if cutting ties with Canada were truly an option, then that option would have to exist on paper, in infrastructure, in cash flow, in replacement capacity. And the first place where the fantasy of a fully self-sufficient America has to face the facts isn't on a diplomatic map. It's underground. In the pipelines, the compressor stations, the currents of energy that flow endlessly between two nations seemingly too intertwined to ever pull apart. If there's one area where slogans about self-reliance most often crash into reality, it's energy. Because energy doesn't wait for political debates, doesn't care about election cycles, and certainly doesn't respond to emotion. It follows only physics, infrastructure, and the flows established over decades. Every day, as America wakes up, more than 4 million barrels of crude oil have quietly crossed the northern border. No ceremony, no headlines, no strategic declarations. They simply flow through pipelines, into storage tanks, directly into refineries, specifically built to process that exact type of oil. For the US energy system, Canadian oil isn't a flexible add-on, it's a foundational component. The key point isn't just that Canada sells a lot of oil to the US, it's about what kind of oil it is. Most of America's refining capacity, especially along the Gulf Coast, is optimized for heavy, high-sulfur crude. That wasn't a random choice. It's the result of decades of investment, of technical decisions made at a time when Canada emerged as the most stable supplier of precisely that kind of oil. Switching oil types isn't just about switching suppliers. It means restructuring refineries, spending billions of dollars, and enduring years of disruption. So when we ask, what if there were no Canada? The answer doesn't lie on a geopolitical map. It lies in the engineering blueprints of every refinery. Venezuela has heavy crude, but its output has plummeted and is shackled by sanctions. Mexico used to be an alternative, but its production has declined for years. The Middle East has oil, but most of it is light crude, and the geographic distance turns every barrel into a costly, high-risk proposition. But oil is only the most visible layer. Deeper down, and far harder to replace, is natural gas. Nearly all the natural gas the United States imports comes from Canada. That number isn't just a reflection of trade. It reflects a physical dependence on a massive cross-border pipeline network. Those pipelines cannot be diversified within a few years, and they certainly can't be turned off with a political decision without triggering serious upheaval. During deep freezes in the Midwest and Northeast, Canadian gas is what keeps heating systems and power plants running. Without it, the issue stops being about prices. It becomes about whether tens of millions of people can maintain normal life. And when energy touches daily life, it quickly breaks out of the policy debate and becomes one of the most politically sensitive domestic issues. Electricity tells a similar story. Power from Canada doesn't make noise, doesn't symbolize dominance, but it plays a key role in balancing the grid across many northern U.S. states. During peak hours when demand spikes, imported electricity isn't a backup plan. It's essential to avoiding blackouts. Removing that power doesn't create a more independent America. It creates a more fragile system. All of this forms a picture that's hard to deny. The U.S.-Canada energy relationship isn't the result of political compromise. It's the product of economic and technical logic. It exists because it works, because it's cheaper, more stable, and fits the infrastructure already in place. To call that relationship a sign of weakness is a symbolic interpretation, not a reflection of how things actually function. And it's right here that the illusion of absolute independence starts to fall apart. In the modern world, independence doesn't mean producing everything yourself. It means being able to control your dependencies and understanding your own limits. Denying dependence doesn't make it disappear. It only makes the shock, if it comes, that much more painful. But energy, as critical as it is still just one piece of the story. It shows us the physical side of this connection. The rest, and no less decisive, lies elsewhere, in factories, warehouses, assembly lines, and the endless stream of trucks crossing the border each day. Because if energy is the bloodstream of the economy, then trade and supply chains are the nervous system, connecting every part together, where the border exists on a map, but has nearly vanished from the reality of production. If energy reveals the physical side of interconnectedness, then trade and supply chains are where the US-Canada relationship most clearly shows its true depth. Here, the border doesn't disappear entirely, but it fades into little more than an administrative formality. In actual production, what exists isn't two separate economies, but a shared operating space where goods move according to the logic of efficiency, not political slogans. Every day, thousands of trucks the northern and southern borders, carrying goods that are nearly impossible to label as purely American or Canadian. They might be coils of steel, electronic components, lumber, or unfinished parts with no final form yet. These goods move back and forth multiple times, being processed in stages, accumulating value at each stop until they finally emerge as a finished product. When American consumers buy a car, a washing machine, or an industrial part, they rarely realize that what they're using is the result of a cross-border process that may have taken months. Canada is the United States' largest export market, not because of geopolitics, but because of geography and economic structure. The short distances, dense infrastructure, and aligned standards make selling to Canada easier in many cases than shipping to a faraway domestic state. For millions of American businesses, Canada isn't a foreign market. It's a natural extension of the domestic one. On the flip side, America's large volume of imports from Canada is often interpreted as a disadvantage, but this view overlooks the nature of modern trade. A trade deficit on paper doesn't reflect the actual value created within a shared supply chain. A component imported from Canada might be a critical input for a product assembled in the US, sold to Americans and generating profit for an American company. If you cut off that component, the deficit figure may shrink, but so will productive capacity. The auto industry is the clearest proof of this reality. In the Great Lakes region, the production line doesn't stop at the border. A part might be stamped in Ontario, fine-tuned in Ohio, partially assembled in Michigan, then sent back to Canada before final completion in the US. Every time it crosses the border, it doesn't leave the US economy. It moves within a shared production ecosystem, one designed to optimize cost, time, and quality. This isn't just true for autos, it's true for aerospace, processed agriculture, lumber, metals, and even high-tech manufacturing. The US-Canada supply chain was built on the assumption that the border would remain stable, that the rules would stay consistent, and that neither side would suddenly weaponize economic ties. That trust is what allows businesses to invest long-term, streamline operations, and accept a high degree of mutual dependence. When that trust is shaken, the consequences don't show up instantly as collapse. They creep in more quietly. Investments are delayed, contracts are rewritten with risk clauses, insurance premiums rise, small decisions accumulate into a bigger trend. Caution replaces expansion, and this is where the paradox becomes clear. Yes, Canada depends heavily on the US market, but that very dependence has made the supply chain so intertwined that the US can't pull away without hurting itself. Dependence in this case isn't a weakness of one side, it's a feature of the entire system. Calls to bring manufacturing back home may sound appealing, but supply chains don't reverse course by political will alone. Factories don't spring up after a speech. Skilled labor doesn't materialize just because tariffs are imposed. And in the gap between intent and reality, costs rise, efficiency drops, and consumers are the ones who pay. Right at this intersection, where commerce meets politics, tariffs emerge as a deceptively simple tool. Impose a tariff to force behavioral change. Impose a tariff to protect domestic production. But when applied to a system already deeply integrated, tariffs are no longer a protective wall. They become a drag, a friction, slowing down the entire economic machine. And that's the moment when the story turns a page. From blurry borders and factory logistics to hard numbers on invoices, inflation reports, and the tables of domestic political debates. Tariffs, instead of striking at a partner, begin to reveal their true nature, a blow that can wound the very hand that swings it. Tariffs are often described as a powerful tool, a lever that governments can pull to force the market to bend to political will. In theory, they represent control. Impose tariffs to protect, to punish, to rebalance. But once they step out of the textbook into an economy already deeply interwoven, tariffs start to behave very differently. They don't discriminate. They don't honor moral or strategic boundaries. And most importantly, they don't obey the slogans that gave birth to them. When new tariffs are introduced, the first shock undeniably hits Canada. Exports drop, orders are delayed or canceled, and regions heavily dependent on the US market begin to feel real pressure. But the story becomes far more interesting and worrisome when numbers from the other side of the border begin to speak. Within months, total US imports fall sharply, not because domestic production suddenly surged, but because the supply chain has been disrupted. American businesses can't pivot as quickly as policy can. Factories accustomed to cross-border rhythms now face component shortages, rising costs, and scrambled production schedules. Instead of creating breathing room for domestic manufacturing, tariffs clog the entire system. At the business level, the reaction isn't political, it's pragmatic. When input costs rise, profit margins are squeezed. If those costs can't be passed back to suppliers, they get pushed forward to consumers. And just like that, in a moment when inflation had only recently begun to ease, old pressures quietly return, persistent and hard to shake. What's striking is that tariffs don't just hit foreign goods. In an interwoven supply chain, many of the things being taxed are in fact semi-finished products designed, ordered, or controlled by American companies themselves. Taxing them is essentially taxing your own production capacity. That's why more and more economists, even those who support a strong role for the state, are now using harsher language: self-inflicted harm, counterproductive, strategic error. In this context, tariffs act like sand in the gears of a well-oiled machine. They don't make the machine stop immediately. They just make everything slower, hotter, and more prone to breakdown over time. And when those breakdowns do occur, It's hard to trace them back to any single decision. The damage spreads, overlaps, and eventually turns into a political issue, far more complex than the original intent. But the deepest consequence of tariffs doesn't show up on a price tag or in an inflation report. It lies in the signal the policy sends. Because when tariffs are levied, not just against adversaries, but against a nation long considered America's closest ally, the message goes beyond economics. It becomes a question of how the United States views its relationships. To Canada, tariffs aren't just a cost. They're a signal that a relationship once built on trust is now being redefined through pressure. And to other nations, it's a quiet warning. If this can happen to Canada, no one can be sure they're safe from the fallout. At that point, the story moves beyond trade. Tariffs are no longer just a tool to control the flow of goods. They begin to touch something deeper in geopolitics, the realm of trust, of strategic security, and of the unsettling question: are allies still being treated as allies, or are they increasingly seen as rivals to be contained? There are losses in geopolitics that can't be measured by GDP, nor do they show up immediately on an inflation chart. They're quieter, slower, but once they emerge, they're incredibly hard to reverse. This is the erosion of trust. And in the story of the US-Canada relationship, it is the deepest and most dangerous layer. For decades, Canada hasn't seen the United States as just a powerful neighbor, but as part of a shared security and economic space. The imbalance in power never turned into constant anxiety, because one fundamental assumption always held true: the U.S. might be tough on its adversaries, but it would show restraint with its allies. That assumption wasn't written into treaties, but it was present in every investment decision, every strategic choice, every long-term calculation in Ottawa. When that assumption begins to wobble, the response isn't panic. It's cold, clear-eyed awareness. Statements like "we don't need Canada" or suggestions that Canada is just the 51st state, taken in isolation, might be dismissed as political bravado. But when they're coupled with tariffs and tangible economic pressure, they stop being words. They become signals. And the signal is clear. This relationship is no longer considered untouchable. For the first time in living memory for many Canadians, the U.S. is no longer assumed to be a safe strategic partner. That feeling doesn't stem from a military incident or a major diplomatic crisis, but from a series of small, repeated decisions that force people to question the motives and limits of American power. When trust is replaced by suspicion, even minor actions are viewed through a different lens. The reaction within Canadian society, then, is emotional, but not impulsive. Nationalism doesn't rise to confront, but to assert itself. Consumers begin to boycott American goods not over price, but as a conscious choice. Fewer Canadians cross the border into the U.S. not because of cost or distance, but because of a growing sense of no longer belonging. These aren't numbers that will shake the American economy overnight, but they are signs of a deeper psychological fracture. More importantly, Canada isn't the only one watching. Other U.S. allies are paying close attention. In an alliance-driven world, precedent carries enormous weight. If a country with the depth of integration, trust, and history that Canada shares with the U.S. can still become the target of economic pressure and rhetorical threats, then no one can be sure of their standing in the American order of priorities. Trust in geopolitics isn't like trade. It can't be rebuilt quickly with concessions or short-term deals. Once damaged, it leads nations to quietly search for backup options, not to sever ties completely, but to reduce risk. They diversify relationships, broaden partnerships, and keep a safer distance from the center of power. And that is the great paradox. When the United States uses its strength to declare that it doesn't need Canada, what it inadvertently encourages is a world in which allies are less willing to place their full trust in America. Not because they turn away, but because they learn to be cautious. In the long run, the strength of a superpower isn't just in how much pressure it can apply, but in whether its partners choose to stay close of their own accord. Allies cannot be managed like rivals because what keeps them committed isn't fear. It's the belief that the relationship offers stability and mutual respect. When that trust begins to crack, the question is no longer who wins a trade dispute. The bigger question becomes whether the alliance system that has long underpinned America's global position remains intact or is slowly being eroded from within. And in geopolitics, fractures like that rarely heal on their own. In the end, when the dust of political debate settles, what remains isn't the echo of grand slogans or bold declarations, it's the relationships that must still function in the real world. Geopolitics may begin with words, but it always ends with consequences. And in this story, those consequences don't require wild speculation. They already exist within the economic and strategic framework of North America. Let's return to the original question, one that seemed deceptively simple. Does the United States truly not need Canada? Strip away the emotion, set aside partisan politics, and look only at what actually exists. The answer becomes almost unavoidable. An economy cannot declare independence from the energy that fuels it, from the supply chains that create jobs for millions, and from a partner that has become a natural extension of itself. You don't need a doomsday scenario to see it. Just imagine a short disruption, a hiccup lasting a few weeks or months. Fuel prices spike, supply chains clog, businesses delay investment, consumers feel the squeeze, domestic politics heats up. This isn't pessimism, it's the cold logic of a deeply interdependent system, decades in the making. History shows that the strongest economies don't collapse because they're too connected to the world, but because they convince themselves they can stand apart from the very rules that built their strength. Math doesn't care about campaign messages. Numbers don't respond to tough talk. They simply reflect reality. And reality tends to arrive later than rhetoric. But when it does, it's hard to ignore. The real issue here isn't just about the relationship between the US and Canada. It's about how power is wielded in the 21st century. Power can coerce, but it can't force trust. It can instill fear, but it can't forge lasting bonds. Long-standing alliances don't endure because there are no conflicts, but because all sides understand that the cost of breaking trust is always greater than the short-term gain. When slogans collide with math, the winner is rarely the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who knows exactly where they stand in the world's web of interdependence, and accepts that position not as a weakness, but as a source of strength. So the idea that America doesn't need Canada isn't just a political argument. It's a test of how mature we are in our understanding of power and responsibility. And like all meaningful tests, it forces us to ask, in a world this tightly connected, does denying reality make a nation stronger or simply more alone? If you have your own thoughts on this question, share them in the comments below. And if you value thoughtful, in-depth analysis that doesn't chase headlines or slogans, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next chapter in the story of geopolitics.